So we have an hour and a half now, and when I looked at that I thought, well, there's no way I'm going to talk at you for an hour and a half, because you would definitely not come back. You probably just drift away during the hour and a half, to be honest. What I want us to look at together is two different incidents from the life of Samuel. So I'm going to speak now for, I don't know, 20-25 minutes, something like that. Then we'll take a break, and I'll tell us a specific time to come back, and then we're going to look at the second, another incident from Samuel's life within this whole session. Hope that makes sense. So hear the word of the Lord from 1 Samuel chapter 3. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel," and he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son, lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever." Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." He said, "Here I am." Eli said, "What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do whatever seems good to him." As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. And from Mark chapter 1, beginning at verse 16. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending the nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. They went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, they entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region. of Galilee. This is the word of the Lord. It was a tough gig being called by God to be a prophet. We get a sense of that on a number of occasions in the Old Testament when God shows up and the prophet tries to wriggle out of it. Isaiah is stricken by a sense of his own sinfulness and inadequacy. Moses protests his speech impediment, and anyway, he quite frankly doesn't want to do it. Jeremiah accuses God of tricking him into ministry. Amos insists that he was only a dresser of sycamore figs, the implication being that he'd never wanted the job in the first place. Jonah runs in quite the opposite direction. And Samuel, well, we don't know what Samuel thought about holding the key role that he had in the nation of Israel for many years. We do know that he was brought to the shrine at Shiloh by his mother as a small child. He had no say in that. But as the curtain rises on his ministry in the passage we just heard read, he has to decide if he will give God his yes. And he doesn't know it yet, but it's going to prove a tough gig. I wonder where you are today in your own sense of call to ministry. Some of you have been serving for many years. Some of you will be fresh and new to the role. Some of you may have joyfully embraced the call that God placed upon you. For others, it may have been much more of a struggle. But certainly, there's a cost to saying yes to God's call, as we all know. There's a cost for ourselves, and as we see in what we know of Samuel's backstory, there's a cost for our families too. Oh, it's an enormous privilege above all else, I think, to be charged with the responsibility of pointing people towards God, of holding out words of hope to the dying, of baptizing new believers into the family of God. But it's a costly privilege. It's a costly calling. It's often a tough gig. In the first half of our time together this afternoon, I'd like to explore something of what Samuel's yes to God meant to him. And perhaps we can see some parallels in our own yes to God. Samuel, of course, marks a turning point in the story of the people of God. He is going to steer them through great change. And if we didn't know it for other reasons, the clear clue in the text is that his birth is miraculous. It results through the direct intervention of God to a woman who has previously been labelled infertile. This is one of the ways that God shows he is doing something new in the Old Testament. He does it, of course, with Sarah. He does it again with some of the other patriarchs' wives. The birth of Samson was announced by an angel to a childless couple. There was a man whose yes to God was very much on his own terms. It happens here with Hannah, and then as the curtain opens in the New Testament, the new thing that God is doing is doubly marked, with two women who should never have been able to have a child and yet who miraculously do. So Samuel's story is marked as a turning point. God is doing something new, and Samuel is the man who is going to lead Israel into and through that transition. But before God acts in the nation, he acts first in the life of the person he is putting at the centre of that change. And for Samuel, it begins with a quiet whisper in the middle of the night. Israel in these days has a pretty low spiritual temperature. Verse 1, or was it 2? I'm not sure. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. In other words, God was seldom heard. God was seldom seen. Let's talk about Eli for a few minutes. Eli is the priest of God at the shrine in Shiloh. If God was going to be seen by anybody, it should have been by Eli. But Eli is represented as a man whose eyesight is growing dim. Now, I don't want to sound ableist or ageist, but we need to understand that such a representation by our ancient writer can symbolize something more significant than the impairment of physical sight alone. God is seldom seen in the nation because the priest of God has a clouding of his vision. A film has grown across his eyes, perhaps. God was seldom seen and God was seldom heard. If God was to be heard by anyone, it should have been by Eli. But Eli seems to have been deaf as well as blind. When God calls Samuel, Eli does not hear the divine voice, but sleeps on. And he doesn't identify that it was God sleeping, even when Samuel wakes him. It takes 3 attempts before Eli finally realizes what's going on. And then he goes straight back to sleep, astonishingly uninquisitive. God is seldom heard because the priest of God has become deaf. A film has grown across his ears, as it were. And it seems as if a film has grown across Eli's heart too. He has 2 rebellious sons. We'll speak a bit more about them in a few minutes. Sons who are abusing their position. Sons whom Eli should have rebuked, corrected, and whose evil doings he should have put an end to. But as verse 13 tells us, he knew what they were doing and he didn't restrain them. He didn't really care. There is a moral failure in the nation because the priest of God has, as it were, the skin across his heart. And so God is moving on. His purposes will never be hampered by somebody's failure to listen or to see or to care. And if Eli will not hear or see or care, there is a young boy whom God will use instead. Eli's failure to instruct Samuel is evident because Samuel does not yet know the Lord. Just stop and think about those words for a moment. How can he have been serving in the sanctuary and yet not know the Lord? And so it takes God 4 calls before Samuel finally says those words which seal his fate. Speak, for your servant is listening. And he doesn't address God by name, even though Eli finally told him to. Presumably he doesn't know who this God is yet. So what is God going to say to the young Samuel? Well, he could have mapped out his plans for the nation. He could speak of the monarchy that was to be established. He might have pointed towards the great King David. He might have described how David would unite the still disparate nation, would defeat the enemies of God, and how God would establish David's line forever. All of these are things that God might have said to the boy Samuel, but God doesn't tell him anything about the future. Instead, he gives him a really hard task, and not something he can defer until he's older, until he understands better, but something he's got to do the very next morning. And what God tells Samuel to do is to call out the power abuses that were at the heart of the sanctuary and at the heart of the nation, to confront the power of vested interest. So what were Eli's sons doing that is so dreadful? Chapter 2 tells us they had no regard for the Lord or for the duties of the priests to the people. They were in it for what they could get out of it. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of service to God and his people, and they fundamentally underestimated how much God cares about such flagrant actions. So they were picking off the best parts of the sacrifice for their own consumption. And although the priest was permitted to eat some of the meat of the sacrifice, it had to be offered to God first. Eli's sons were bypassing the sacrifice and simply taking the meat for their own consumption. In chapter 2, verses 12 and 17, we read these words. They had no regard for the Lord or for the duties of the priests to the people, for they treated the offerings of the Lord with contempt. It was worse even than that, though. There were also women who were serving in the sanctuary, women who had dedicated their lives to the service of God. And Hophni and Phinehas thought that these godly women were a perk of the job. These men were in it for what they could get out of it. They contemptuously took whatever they wanted. They had no notion of devoted service to God. They were abusers. And they fundamentally underestimated how much God would care about that. Who is able to stop a powerful person who is acting abusively from the very top of the pyramid? That's a very pertinent question right now, isn't it? Who might have stopped Eli's sons? Well, Eli himself, conceivably, but as we've seen, he was too spiritually indolent to do anything about it. God had previously sent a prophet to denounce Eli and his sons, but there doesn't seem to be any response to that prophet. So who else could confront this system of power? Not the people coming to bring their sacrifices. The priest wields ultimate power in such a situation because he controls access to God. Let's never underestimate the power of being someone who, in a sense, controls access to God. Nor could the women that Hophni and Phinehas were abusing. The power was utterly stacked against them in that situation. And so God sent, as he will again, a young lad, untested, callow, green. And the first thing Samuel is told to do is to confront the power of vested interest. Because until that is addressed, the people of God will be in spiritual stalemate. I'm very struck by the beginning of Jesus's ministry as Mark sets it out in his gospel, and as I read a few minutes ago. Excuse me a second. After Jesus' baptism and the calling of the first disciples, he goes to Capernaum and he enters the synagogue in his hometown. And immediately he encounters a man with an unclean spirit. Now, this is such a familiar story that maybe it doesn't disturb us as it ought. A demon in the synagogue. The forces of darkness in a place that should have been a bastion for the forces of light. And if that hasn't disturbed us enough, the creature's words really should. It says this: "What have you come here for, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Have you come to destroy us?" This demon in the synagogue is the force of vested interest and status quo. There is something powerful and rotten at the heart of this synagogue, something that senses the move of God which is erupting, something that smells the change in the wind and utterly resists it. Here at the heart of society, in the urbane city of Capernaum, Jesus encounters the very first power confrontation of his ministry. He has come up against the powers of darkness, which identify him without doubt as God's emissary. They protest his coming, and they are only cast down from their strongholds with convulsions and shrieking when he speaks the word of authority. And it's no coincidence that Jesus met a demon that day, because the Son of God was revealed to destroy the works of the evil one, as we know. And it's no coincidence that this is also what young Samuel was charged to do. It was inevitable, because as God begins to work, the forces of vested interest which bind his people must be overthrown. And if those forces are found within the church or within the heart of God's worshipping community, the overthrow is even more important. We might put this another way. Samuel's yes to God implies a no to all the other calls which will beckon. His "I am yours" to God means that he must say to Eli and his sons, "I am not yours." Certainly there are things he owes Eli, and he will continue to owe him. He owes him respect. Presumably he has certain duties to perform at the sanctuary, and he owes Eli the faithful completion of these tasks. But he has told God, "I am yours." And this means saying to Eli, "I am not yours." It means that the call to speak the hard word must be obeyed, because he is God's servant, not Eli's. And what he's practicing here in the sanctuary, he will later put into practice in the wider nation. His response to God, "I am yours," is mirrored in his willingness to say the hard word to God's people, "I am not yours." But Samuel's "I am yours" to God also means saying to all other things, you are not mine. He's called to be a servant of the Lord, and that makes him neither the servant nor the master of the people of God. This means that when Hophni and Phinehas beckon him, as perhaps they did, to share in the forbidden delights of the corrupt priesthood, his answer has to be, they are not mine, because he has first told God, I am yours. This means that when he's in a position of power in the nation, able to take advantage of this position for personal enrichment, his prior word to God, I am yours, means that he must say to the people, you are not mine. Fast forwarding for a moment, much later in chapter 12, Samuel has this conversation with the people. Here I am. Testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me and I will restore it to you. They said, you have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from the hand of anyone. Back to the beginning of the story. Samuel obeyed God's command and brought the hard word to Eli, and God honoured Samuel's obedience. By the end of the chapter, Samuel has come of age, both literally and in his standing within the nation. All now know that he is a trustworthy prophet, and none of his words fall to the ground. And notice this, the Lord continued to appear, and he revealed himself through his word. In other words, God was once again seen, and God was once again heard in the nation. It was a tough gig, but by the power of God and through his obedience and willing to address the power of vested interests, Samuel had successfully changed the spiritual temperature of the nation. We're going to pick up the story a little later, and I'm going to read now from 1 Samuel 7. Beginning from verse 1. And the people of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. They consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. From the day that the ark was lodged at Kiriath Jearim, a long time passed, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel mourned after the Lord. Then Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Astartes from among you. Direct your heart to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So Israel put away the Baals and the Astartes, and they served the Lord only. Then Samuel said, gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered at Mizpah, and they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. They fasted that day and said, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the people of Israel at Mizpah. When the Philistines heard that the people of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. The people of Israel said to Samuel, do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us and pray that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. So Samuel took a sucking lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. As Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack Israel. But the Lord thundered with a mighty voice that day against the Philistines and threw them into confusion, and they were routed before Israel. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them down as far as beyond Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Jeshanah, and named it Ebenezer, for he said, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." So the Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel. The hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The towns that the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath, and Israel recovered their territory from the hand of the Philistines. There was peace also between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would come back to Ramah, for his home was there. He administered justice there to Israel and built there an altar to the Lord. And from Luke chapter 12, beginning at verse 35. The words of Jesus. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for everyone? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and prudent manager, whom his master will put in charge of his slaves, to give them their allowance of food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master will find at work when he arrives. Truly, I tell you, he will put that one in charge of all his possessions. But if that slave says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and if he begins to beat the other slaves, men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. That slave who knew what his master wanted, but did not prepare himself or do what was wanted, will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. This is the word of the Lord. So we rejoin Samuel now on the cusp of another great transition in Israel's history, a transition that he is going to lead, although at this stage it's unclear that he has any inkling of that. Our story recommences after 20 years of silence. Now, prior to those 20 years, we have the dreadful time when the Ark of the Lord was captured by the Philistines, and this, of course, was Hophni and Phinehas's undoing. This is the moment when they choose to take the Ark of the Lord into battle with them as a sort of talisman. The Ark is, the people are conquered in battle. The Ark is stolen by the Philistines. They are defeated. The Ark is captured, rather, by the Philistines. And Hophni and Phinehas die. And I'm digressing slightly from my notes here, but this is, if you haven't read Walter Brueggemann's little book, very little book, called Ichabod Towards Home, I commend it to you. And he unpacks this particular narrative, and because what happens is the daughter, one of the daughters-in-law of Eli, is pregnant, heavily pregnant, and when she hears that the battle has been lost and that the Ark of the Lord has been lost, she goes into premature labor, and she delivers her son, and she names him Ichabod, which means where is the glory? Because for her, what is most devastating, as for the nation, what is most devastating is the loss of the ark, not the defeat of the soldiers. That's the backstory. That was the word of God against vested interest finally coming to pass, and that's the backstory for where we rejoin now. So our story recommences 20 years after that. At the beginning of those 20 years, the Ark of the Lord, having been captured by the Philistines, is eventually sent back up into Israelite territory, only for there to be a great plague because the people had treated it lightly. That was just the latest in a long line of moral failures and catastrophes in Israel's recent history. But for 20 years, it appears that things have been quite settled. Samuel operates as the last and perhaps the greatest judge of Israel. And he has an annual circuit that takes him between the three cities of Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah as he leads the people and administers justice. God is stirring, but I suspect that from Samuel's perspective, things had settled into a pattern, perhaps even a rut. Day in, day out, he's just quietly, faithfully getting on with what God has called him to do. These are his bread and butter years. I wonder if he thinks that God has nothing more in store for him. Of course, you and I know that God still has a lot more in store for Samuel at this point in the story. His greatest years are still ahead. But should Samson's ministry be regarded as a failure if it had ended at this point? Would it have been such a bad thing if God had said to him at the end of these 20 years, well, thank you, Samuel, for your service. You've been faithful, you've been dogged, you've worked away quietly without showmanship or self-enrichment. Well done, good and faithful servant. That doesn't sound to me like a failed ministry. I don't believe God's pleasure in us is a function of how successful we are. But God is now, at last, stirring up his people. Why? Why now? Has Samuel suddenly done something different? Has he suddenly preached that killer sermon or prayed that magic prayer? I don't think so. I think God just decided it was time. I'd like to suggest that when God chooses to stir up his people, is his prerogative. We can certainly create conditions that make it more or less likely that he will bless our ministries. But long, slow, faithful, patient ministry may or may not be touched by a fresh move of the Spirit. That is God's prerogative. It's not in our gift, and it's not in our control. Maybe you resonate with Samuel's 20 years of faithfully doing the circuit. Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah. Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah. Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah. And when I wrote those words, I was thinking more of the monotony, I suppose, the routineness of ministry. But as I went over it again this morning, I thought some of you may actually be looking after more than one chapel, and maybe you do genuinely rotate between them. Certainly some of our Anglican colleagues would identify with that, I think. There are many mysteries about God, but one that I frequently ponder is his patience. Sometimes that is patience with our foolishness, and I'm grateful for that, with our sinfulness, and I celebrate that, not the sinfulness, the patience, with our hardness of heart or our slowness of mind. But sometimes it is simply that God's timing is different from ours. He's not in a rush to fix things. He's not in a rush to show his hand. Even when we think all the conditions are right for God to act, God so often works to a different timetable from us. His people are in Egypt for 400 years before he sends Moses to bring them out. There's another 400 years of waiting between the restoration of the temple under Ezra and an angel showing up to Zechariah in that same temple. Even the apparent utter defeat at Golgotha is allowed to weigh upon those who love Jesus for many, many long hours. Yeah, I know Jesus had told them in advance that he was going to rise from the dead, but they hadn't really taken it in, had they? And God doesn't rush, doesn't send an angel down to reassure them. He doesn't rush to tell them it's all going to be okay. Maybe this is a season in your ministry when you are faithfully and doggedly, week in, week out, getting on with the unglamorous bread and butter work of ministry. Maybe you're wondering why it doesn't feel as if God is moving. Well, that is his prerogative. He works to his own timetable, and our responsibility is simply to be faithful. But now we come to the point in Samuel's story where God is moving, and to what end will not be clear for quite a while yet, but there is a sense that, as we would put it today, that the Spirit is stirring. And the first sign of that is that all the house of Israel mourned. It's interesting that this is the first sign of God being at work in this story. Previously, 20 years ago, in the previous chapter, the whole house of Israel had mourned because of the heavy blow that the Lord had struck them. This is a natural sort of grief, which we'd all have felt, no doubt. But now their mourning is of a different quality. Sadness in itself doesn't prove that God is at work, of course. There are many reasons why we might be sad. Paul puts it in his second letter to the Corinthians like this: godly grief produces repentance that leads to salvation. And I think there is something of that godly grief in what we read in verse 2. And although Samuel's thoughts are not recorded for us, I do wonder if what he's really saying to himself at this point, or perhaps to God, is, oh, at last, finally, after 20 years. But what he actually says to the people is this: if you are returning with all your heart, then take action. Repent what is wrong. And in more positive terms, turn your hearts back to the Lord and serve him with single-mindedness. In his 20 years of dogged, patient, bread and butter ministry, Samuel has not lost his spiritual attentiveness. He's not lost his expectancy that God might act at any moment. And so he's poised to respond when it happens. I think it's really hard for us to do that. I think it's really hard for us to sustain real attentiveness, real expectancy. When we're ministering for long periods without any obvious results, doubt might start to creep in, or laziness, or simply routine. And it's not easy then to detect the first stirrings of the Spirit, the first change in the direction of the wind. I wonder what it was about Samuel's own spiritual practice that enabled him to be attentive in this way, to remain attentive in this way. But whatever it was, he doesn't need telling twice. The house of Israel begins to grieve, not simply because of what they have experienced, but this time because they know they are lacking something in the presence of God. And Samuel is right on it. Okay, if you really mean it, then repent. Turn your heart back to God and come gather at Mizpah. Now, I noticed there was a bit of chat going on about, I'm just going to open it up again a second, about names of chapels, and a Bethel, was it a Bethel and a Mizpah? Can't quite scroll properly. Gilgal? Excellent. Well, I think it's interesting that Samuel chooses Mizpah as a meeting place. In some ways, it's probably quite a pragmatic choice. It seems to be a place where large gatherings do take place. It's where, for example, in years to come, Israel will assemble to choose their first king, to choose Saul. But I think the place has a symbolic significance as well. Mizpah means watchtower or watching place. Again, maybe pragmatically, this is because it was on a hill. And if you Google it, you can still see the remains of it and see the hill. And it commanded good views, therefore, of the surrounding countryside. But Mizpah is a place where people gather as they choose to be watchful of what God might be saying and doing. Mizpah is also a place that had a dreadful history. It's hard to get the chronology of the book of Judges clear because it kind of goes in a cycle. But at some point in Israel's past, perhaps not very long previously, Mizpah had been the site of muster, where the men of Israel had gathered to assemble an army against their brothers in the tribe of Benjamin. Mizpah was a place of civil war. It was a place of enormous moral failure, a place where human pride and arrogance and greed and vengeance had risen unchecked and caused God's people to turn upon themselves. And as Samuel gathers his own generation of people at Mizpah, they are metaphorically and perhaps even literally treading upon the bones of their own broken history. So I think it's interesting that Samuel chose this place. What does it tell us about his leadership? Well, I think he was unafraid of that history. It might be casting a shadow, but it was not going to control the present. But there was a sense in which his choice to gather there is perhaps an acknowledgement of what has happened there before. And it's interesting to notice that after the civil war of Judges 20 and 21, there is no sense of repentance. But now the people are repentant. Now they gather and fast and declare their sin. The past stories of our churches, the history that might long predate our own time there, can be very important as we attempt to move forwards. I had a friend who did PhD work on what's called the angel of the church, the sort of language that's used by Wink to describe the spiritual character of an institution. And he looked at, it's essentially a historical or partly historical analysis, and he looked at church meeting minutes and looked at how churches had conducted themselves for generations. And he could see that there was a real sense in which the spiritual character of a church seemed to repeat itself, that churches that had been generous and missional would continue to be generous and missional, and churches that had a history of falling out of love with their ministers seemed to continue to fall out of love with their ministers. That there seemed to be something about a spiritual dynamic of a church that is passed on transgenerationally. The history that might long predate our time as a church can be very important as we attempt to move forwards. And how we handle that history can require enormous wisdom. I don't think Samuel gives us a blueprint here by any means, but I do notice that the past is not allowed to limit what God might do in the future. And I also wonder if there's even a sense in which he's helping the people to acknowledge that past and, in a sense, gathering up repentance for it, even in the present moment and a later generation. There seems to be something redemptive in what happens that day. And of course, this story does teach that God does not allow the past to limit our present, that God is the God of new beginnings and of redemption, of people and of institutions, and that he has bound himself by covenant to his people, faithless though they were, and faithless though we also so often are. But Samuel and the Israelites are not left in peace to enjoy their restored worship for very long, because their gathering at Mizpah is seen as a threat by the Philistines and is immediately challenged. Once again, there's a pragmatic reason underlying this. The Philistines, who've been ruling over parts of Israel for a while, may well have banned large gatherings. You can understand the kind of military logic of it. It would make strategic military sense. But there's something more profound at work here, I think, because God's people have gathered with a renewed heart towards him, and they are offering their sacrifices for worship and restoration. And it says it is at this moment that the enemy attacks. I wonder if the people had come up to Mizpah armed for the battle just in case. We're not told. But we do know that the veil between heaven and earth was very thin that day. And as the Philistines draw near to attack Israel, who is gathered peacefully and engaged in godly worship, the Lord thunders with a mighty voice, and the Philistines are utterly routed. Again, I don't want to draw simplistic parallels or to derive enduring promises from this particular narrative. God is free and he acts on his own prerogative. Sometimes he will save his people when they are attacked, and sometimes he won't. I heard fairly recently about an African church that was gathered by the river for a baptism ceremony. And as they were celebrating the baptisms, a crocodile came and took one of the young men who had just given his baptismal vows. Gathering in the name of God with faithful hearts is no guarantee that the enemy will always be defeated. But this story does remind me of the reality of the spiritual battle that we are in. It reminds me that we needn't expect everything to go smoothly when God is on the move. Quite the opposite, perhaps. It reminds me too to be attentive, not simply to the stirring of the Spirit, although very much to that, but also to the riposte of the enemy, to the ways that the enemy might seek to disrupt what God is doing. And as I mentally stand with Samuel on that mount at Mizpah with its painful history of civil war, I remember that one of the most effective ways that the enemy will do that is by promoting envy, jealousy, pride, and all of the other nasty little vices that can lead to the church self-destructing. We don't always need Philistines to help us to do that. And now Samuel performs another action, which is so significant that it's made its way into our own language and perhaps the naming of our churches. He takes a stone, or perhaps a pile of stones, and he sets it up near Mizpah. And as they were wont to do in those days, he gives it a name, Ebenezer. Thus far, the Lord has helped us. He plants a great flag, as it were, naming what God has done, celebrating it. A flag, a stone, which will serve as a memorial for the future. It seems to me that two of the most important things that we do as ministers is to notice when the Spirit is at work and to name what God has done. If we are not attentive to the work of God, it's hard to expect the people we serve to be attentive. I noticed that Samuel was poised in expectancy in his long years of faithful, dogged bread and butter ministry. That he was found ready, like the faithful steward or the wise virgins of Jesus' parable. We certainly need to be ready for the Perusia, but we also need to be ready for the many stirrings of the Spirit in the meantime. And I noticed that Samuel is quick to identify what God has done, taking no credit for himself. He's quick to lead God's people in an act of gratitude. He's quick to name God's mighty work, and he's keen to set up a lasting memorial to it. There was another Mizpah in a much earlier part of the story of Israel. It was a pile of stones which Jacob and Laban built between them to mark the border between their territories. It was a pile of stones that marked their mutual distrust. But they named it Mizpah, watchtower. May the Lord watch between us. There's two piles of stones for you then. Ebenezer, thus far the Lord has been our help. Mizpah, we are watching, or perhaps the Lord is watching. If you were going to build a cairn today, what would you name it? Thank you. Well, those of you who know me will know that I'm a sucker for a good old hymn with rich words. I couldn't speak about Ebenezer's without us. I would like us to sing it. Maybe we will sing it with our on mute. But let's worship with this song, and then I'm going to hand back over to whoever's closing us out. I think it's Emma. Thank you.